through having a broad enough statistical database, you can easily derive a system of measurement that was used. So in essence, it's like doing the same sort of principle, applying it to this. You go in and you would do accurate surveys of these structures, bearing in mind, of course, that they have eroded and probably shifted around somewhat. But what you would do is you would want to have enough measurements so that you could begin to try to decipher whether there was, in fact, common units of measurement used throughout. And some work is being done on the North American structures, but again, hampered by the fact that so many of them are gone, you know, and have to only be accessed from ancient surveys. But like we can look at the Assyrian foot here, and we discovered that it's 1.08 modern feet. And remember I pointed out to you that there was multiple earthwork squares that were exactly 27 acres? Well, a 27-acre square turns out to be 1,080 feet on a side. So, as it turns out, 1,080 feet is precisely 1,000 Assyrian feet. And examples like this can be multiplied. It appears that these things in ancient America were being built using a system of measurement that was common to the so-called Old World, was being used in megalithic Britain, was being used in Sumeria, possibly in Egypt as well. So what, if anything, would this imply? Let's assume for the sake of argument that it's not a coincidence. What could this imply? Speak forth. What?
They came up with the same system of measurement from a common base.
I would say, here's the alternatives. It was independently derived from for whatever reason. We could assume that here in North America, they've come up with a way of building these structures, orienting them to the cosmos, using certain systems of measurement, and then we go back, we go to the Old World, and we find exact parallels. The same kind of orientations, the similar geometries, same sacred geometry, and evidence that common systems of measurement were being used. Which leads us to think that this goes beyond something that we can dismiss as mere coincidence, and that there's some kind of a coherent system at work. So then the next question becomes, when we look at Sumeria, Egypt, megalithic England, North America, can we trace a descent from one to the other? Or, like what you said, which I'm inclined to think, is that perhaps each of these traces back to some much deeper unknown source. And that's what I'm inclined to at this point. Some unknown source that existed prior to recorded history that created a system of measurement, of astronomical orientation, of using sacred geometry to create these gigantic monumental structures, whether of earth or stone, and somehow or another were able to inspire various discrete cultural groups. It's interesting when you go back and you begin to read into the legends of the American Indians. Like here, this is Cherokee country around here. The Cherokee have legends about the Nunahai. These were these ancient ones. In fact, if you ever go hiking up at Blood Mountain, there used to be anyway a sign up there about the Cherokee legend about the Nunahai. And basically the Nunahai were the people, according to the Cherokee concept, who could travel anywhere. That's literally how, in fact, what Nunahai translates as, the people who could travel anywhere. Now, you go to ancient Sumeria, and the ancient Sumerians talked about this group called the Anunnaki. Phonetically kind of suggestive. We have the Nunahai in North America, the Anunnaki in ancient Sumeria. Interestingly, the Anunnaki were the people who could travel anywhere. So you had these striking parallels now in traditions, in mythical patterns on both sides of the planet. What is this pointing to? Well, it's pointing to something I think that's perhaps a truth that we're not supposed to know about. And the reason we're not supposed to know about it is because our history has essentially been cut and dried and handed to us on a plate through our government schooling. We're told, this is the way it is. This is now the apotheosis of civilization. We rose from, lower social forms, you know, from hunter-gatherers through barbarism, and now we're up at the pinnacle of culture now. There's no mystery left. It's all been explained. It's only a matter of filling in a few details here and there. And if you want to get to the bottom of anything, you just turn to the appropriate authority. But I think what is being suggested here is that really there is a mystery, a vast mystery about origins of culture, about origins of civilization, about what was going on this planet prior to recorded history. And clearly when you begin looking at information like this, to me it's pointing in that direction, that there's a whole other dimension of history that's been completely neglected within the official accounts. And it could be that there's, I think, perhaps political reasons for that. Again, getting down to the idea that, as Mircea Eliade said, what we have is an attempt to trivialize our own history to the point where it's been demystified. Because everything now is defined, and all you have to do is go to the proper authority to get the final explanation on everything. You know, evolution, Darwinian evolution explains the origin of life. You know, this linear ascendance from, you know, the old Stone Age to the new Stone Age to the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, and then finally to the Industrial Revolution and to where we're at now, is all worked out, and there's no mystery. I would suggest that that's a very misleading concept, that there's a very deep mystery about our own origins on this planet. And one fact that I frequently like to emphasize is that we modern humans, according at least to the most recent anthropological research, entities, creatures exactly identical to ourselves have been around on this planet for at least 150,000 years. At least. Perhaps 200,000 years or longer. Well, what that implies is very interesting, because our recorded history goes back 5,000 years. So if you look at a timeline, you know, if this stick represents the whole of human history, since we, Homo sapiens sapiens, have been walking around on this planet, our recorded history is 1 inch. So here's our recorded history. We go back 1 inch, and we're back in, you know, ancient Egypt, ancient Sumeria. What was going on all the rest of this time that humans were inhabiting this planet? And why is there no record of what they were doing? You know, what we've been, the kind of the stereotype that we've been sort of given here is, you know, the caveman archetype. You know, people living in caves and presumably not figuring out that there was a way that you could actually accumulate knowledge, transmit knowledge, you know. So this went on for 100,000 or 200,000 years, and then apparently out of boredom, people got up all of a sudden one day and said, let's start civilization. So they went and they built a 480-foot one tall pyramid in Egypt that couldn't be duplicated today. They built these astronomical observatories all over the planet. I think clearly there's a whole other dimension to our story on this planet that perhaps prior to our generation was not accessible. Because a lot of the information and stuff, like, for example, that I've pulled together here, even 20 years ago or 30 years ago, you couldn't have pulled this information together. I mean, discoveries within the last few decades, like all of the recreations of these things that I've been showing you, a lot of those are only 10 years old, 20 years old. We're learning things now because we have remote sensing capabilities. We have radar that can penetrate into the ground and see things that's underground. You know, we can see perspectives from outer space that we couldn't see before. And once you get this broader perspective, you can begin to see things that you can't see when you're down, you know, too close to it. So what I'm trying to do is get people fired up about finding out this big story that's basically the missing story of the human species on this planet. For the main reason, the pragmatic reason, is that I think that in order to maximize our probabilities of having a successful future, we need to understand our authentic past. And if we don't understand our authentic past, it diminishes our probabilities of having a successful future considerably. Because as they say, you know, those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. Well, there's a big, big chunk of our past that's been forgotten. But I think that it still can be recovered. And one way it can be recovered is the fact that we have mythology. And mythology is the record of what happened, what transpired to the human species on this planet prior to the written record. So we go back and we have the historical record that sort of fades out into the myths of the past between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago, and then we get into the mythic record. And up till now, the attitude has been, well, myth represents, you know, primitive mind, ignorant mind, pre-scientific mind, inventing and conjuring up these images to try to explain what they couldn't understand. You know, that the gods did this and the gods did that, and this is how they explained the workings of the world. Well, see, I don't think that that's an accurate interpretation at all. I think that myth actually represents a very scientific way of explaining the world. And it uses symbols, symbology, just like modern science does. It's just that the symbols it uses are very different than the kinds of symbols modern science uses. But they're symbols that can be transmitted. They can be transmitted orally. They can be transmitted in the form of art. They can be transmitted in the form of song and epic poetry. They can be transmitted in the form of ritual. They can be transmitted in the form of architecture. All of these things are vehicles for the transmission of this kind of mythic wisdom or the mythic history. And so it has a way of perpetuating itself because it has this diverse method by which it can propagate itself through all of these different avenues. And we're in a position now where, a very privileged position, because not a generation or two ago, nobody had access to the kind of information that we now have access to. And we're in a position now where we can begin really assembling these pieces to see the coherent image much better than or more effectively than anybody could have prior to our own time. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it was not possible. I mean, there were some philosophers, some occultists, some spiritually oriented people through whatever means or other were able to access stuff, but it was not possible to scientifically corroborate anything. If somebody went into a deep state of meditation and began to channel information, it could be used as a guideline, but there was no method of verification. Whereas now we're in a situation where we can verify things and we can see things from these enhanced perspectives. And we have resources of information, abundant information nobody ever had before. It's like taking a puzzle with 5,000 pieces and scattering the pieces far and wide. And now we're in a position where we can start reassembling those pieces into a coherent image, which is the image of our own past and origin on this planet, which I think is far more profound than what we've been led to believe, that as a result of some accidental sequence of events in natural selection and so forth. So on that note, let's continue with some of the stuff we've been looking at here. I'll give you a few glimpses into how the system works. The encoding of information. Once again, we look at the ground plan of Stonehenge, and superimposed on that ground plan is one of the sacred geometry keys. And this is the well-known Star of David. But we also have the solution here to a sacred geometry problem called the squaring of the circle. And the squaring of the circle was considered to be the preeminent problem of sacred geometry by which one could harmonize conflicting forces, conflicting energies, and so forth. We'll get into, if we do a sacred geometry course, this is something we get into in very great detail. But suffice it for now to say that this particular exercise, essentially you see that there's an outer circle right here, and then there's a square enclosing an inner circle. The squaring of the circle is that this circle here and this square here and here and here has the same perimeter. And again, that's a solution of a geometric problem. And it's encoded into the proportions of Stonehenge. And it's also encoded into the relationship between the Earth and the Moon and the profile of the Great Pyramid, which encodes the same precise geometry. And this is just an elaboration of it, and this is something that we will explore if we do a sacred geometry course. This is like the kind of stuff we get into. We not only we learn to draw these and reconstruct these patterns, and then we see how they're applied. But in this particular case, I want you to notice very carefully how what is happening here. And you have, if you follow this path right here, that's the profile of the Great Pyramid of Giza, which is 760 feet at the base, 482 feet tall. It has a slope to base angle of 51 degrees, 51 minutes. And that happens to be a magic angle and one of the key angles in sacred geometry. But when you create this particular pattern, which is one of the key sacred diagrams within the context of sacred geometry, we put 4 moons around it to represent the 4 weeks of the month and the 4 seasons of the year and the 4 cardinal directions and so on. And when you superimpose the profile of the Great Pyramid 4 times around, in the overlap you get this particular octagonal geometry. Now that octagonal geometry is found on the atomic level through the various patterns caused. This is a refraction pattern of a platinum. This is a platinum atom, what we see right here, resonating. What it is how a photograph like this is produced is a very, very, very sharp needle of platinum is placed under a photographic template, and an electric charge is run through it, and when it does that, it starts shooting off electrons within a certain geometric pattern. And it creates this interference pattern. Now this is, like I said, is a platinum atom. Platinum actually has a very important function within a lot of the ancient rituals, particularly in ancient Egypt. But notice the geometry there, and you see how the geometry of that interference pattern of the platinum atom coincides with this squaring of the circle exercise in the profile of the Great Pyramid and the Earth-Moon relationship. Okay, now we go here back to Newark, and we discover that the octagon of Newark is precisely that same interference pattern. Now again, this could be coincidence, but when you begin to explore this system in depth and you begin to find these kinds of relationships encoded redundantly, it soon becomes impossible to dismiss it with the idea that it's merely coincidence, and leads one to think that there was something much more advanced and sophisticated going on here. And so you see there, I've tried to show you that that there is this encoded sacred geometry. So hopefully you're not disappointed that you didn't get at least a little dose of sacred geometry. All of these numbers up here are interesting and important. You see that radius of the Sarsen stone circle, which is this circle right here, is 50.4 feet. And one of the units of measurement determined through exhaustive statistical studies was this thing called a megalithic yard, which is 2.71827 feet. Well, when you convert the radius of this, which is 50.4 feet, to megalithic yards, you discover it's 18.54 feet, which is essentially the lunar cycle.
Number 2.7.
That's yes, it's awful close to E, the natural. That's right. So you've got a little bit of background in this, apparently. Did you hear what he said? The natural base of logarithms. We would get into that in a sacred geometry class, not here tonight. It's a little bit complicated, but yeah, it's very close to that. And these numbers turn out to be significant too, because 10.8 feet and 39.6 feet, that's precisely the ratio of the radius of the moon to the radius of the Earth. The radius of the moon is 1,080 miles. The radius of the Earth is 3,960 miles. So there are astronomical constants built into these geometries. And what I'm trying to show you here is that these geometries were underlying all of these ancient structures, not only in the old world where we would sort of almost expect to find them, but in their New World counterparts, in their American counterparts. So, you see the 27 acres? Right there, can you read that, what that says? 1,080 feet. So this actually, as it turns out, is one of the key numbers from ancient traditions. We find it referenced in the ancient Vedic writings from India, which are the oldest religious writings extant on Earth, the Vedic writings. And this 1,080 was a key number there. I showed you a slide of Angkor Wat. Well, one of the key numbers upon which Angkor Wat was dimensioned was this number right here, which occurs over and over again in all of these structures, ancient earthwork structures. Area 27 acres, side length 1,080 feet. And if you recall, we discovered that there was actually an Assyrian foot used in ancient Assyria, which would have probably been inherited from the Sumerians that preceded the Assyrians, and it was 10.8 feet. So 1,000 of those exactly was the side of this square. Is it possible that that is merely coincidence, or is there a system at work here? Each one of these is a different example of a great earthwork structure. Oh, yes?
With 1,000 of them, then that reference like how we use like 1,000 paces per mile?
Yes, yes, exactly. This, to give you an example here, this whole complex doesn't exist except for the central mound, site mound. This is the only thing that exists left of that whole complex, is this right here. So you can see again, like 95% of these things are gone. All we can be grateful is that we have the surveys that were done, thanks to Squire and Davis, who went out. It had to have been an arduous undertaking to catalog these things, survey them accurately over a period of decades that they devoted to this.
Have you ever found a modern representation of this in modern architecture? Or?
Not really. Not really. I have found some that I don't think was intentional. I mean, Frank Lloyd Wright, and a lot of his organic architecture seems to have hit very close to some of this stuff. Le Corbusier certainly rediscovered the golden section and began to incorporate that into his architecture. I think Mies van der Rohe utilized it in, wasn't he the one that came up with the design for the United Nations building? He used 3 golden rectangles stacked on top of each other. I don't think back when they were doing that, this information was available. To my knowledge, having done this and having done workshops and presentations in sacred geometry and its applications to architecture, I will frequently get architects showing up. And generally, it's not widely known. I'm trying to do my part to get people interested in recovering this and figuring out how we can apply it in our own modern life to make our world a better place, a more harmonious place. So yeah, you can see that this perfect square of 27 acres, 1,080 feet on a side, was repeated over and over and over again. Now, there's a lot more to the geometry of this than we have been able to get into here now. Notice side of a square, 1,080 feet. So it's perfectly accurate to say that the side of this square is exactly 1,000 Assyrian feet. Does that mean that somebody from ancient Assyria came over here and laid this thing out and built it? Or does it mean that there was, in prehistoric times, a universal system of measurement, parts of which were inherited by many cultures at the dawn of history? And this brings us to something else that's interesting too. You'll notice here that the original square has been eroded away. Right? This thing doesn't exist anymore. The Works East Earthwork Complex. Squire and Davis, this was a survey done in 1846. Okay, in 1846, the river, I believe that's the Muskingum River, this would have been in Ohio, had eroded away about a third of the original square. Well, what that clearly implies is that the square was older than the erosion of the river of this bank. So then the question becomes, when did this river erode the bank? And see, if we had a date on that, then we would know that the structure, the earthwork structure, existed before that erosion went on. Now, what I've been doing is studying maps. And remember I showed you the digital relief map when we first started this, showing you the glacial meltwater pathways? Well, a lot of these things have been eroded by floods that appear to have been occurring at the end of the Ice Age, which would suggest, and here's the tragedy of it is, a lot of these that show this kind of erosion. Let's see here. Yeah, here's another example. You see, here's a circle that's been eroded. Well, here's the Scioto River up here. Well, at some time in the past, the water flowed through here, and there was an ancient tributary of the Scioto River, of which this is a bank. So if we knew when the water was flowing here, we would know that that would be a minimum age for this complex. Now, some of these appear that the water flowing in these pathways may have been 7,000 or 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. So some of these things may have actually been much, much older than the dates that they have been given. Like, for example, here's the High Banks earthwork that was surveyed by Squire and Davis. It was still intact back in the 1840s. And you'll notice again, here's that same octagon that we found at Newark. Precisely the same octagon. And it has the apertures that line it up with the cosmic movements. Here's an aerial photograph taken in 1938, and the only thing you can see is the ghostly outline of the original structure.
Do the apertures move from place to place? I mean, like, I imagine it's different depending on where you are.
Yes, that's correct. It varies from where you are in the country, primarily by latitude. Primarily, changes in latitude would change the cosmic angles.
So wherever they're aligned for that location.
Right. You could not take this structure and move it 300 miles south or north and still have the same alignments. That's correct.
The size is the same.
But the sizes are the same, yes. And here's another example. There are many examples of these where part of the structure has been effaced by some ancient erosion that has transpired long ago. You can see here, see how this little gully transects? So we can presume from this that this erosion here is younger than this structure. So that's where my, notice diameter of the circle, 1,050 plus feet. Probably originally 1,056, because there were many of them that appear to have been 1,056 feet. And here's a causeway that's truncated by some, now, see, at this point, we don't know whether the causeway just ended here at the bank or whether it continued further south and then was truncated by erosion. Now, actually, all of these dimensions are significant to somebody who's familiar with the geometric relations. Let's go on. Okay. Here's the Watson Break Mound Complex near Monroe, Louisiana, built on the floodplain of the Wichita, I believe. River, circa 5,400 years before present. Now, it's a whole series of mounds that are laid out on a certain form, and actually there are 11 artificial mounds, and they were not understood to be artificial prior to the 1980s when they were doing when they cut the timber on them and they discovered that they were artificial. And Brad and I went down there a couple of years ago, and I had a chance to interview Joe Saunders, who's the lead archaeologist on this. And they were just getting ready at that point to publish the dates, because he said they had assembled 23 radiocarbon dates. And the reason they did that was because when they first got the dates in, they were so anomalously old that they didn't believe them. And they didn't want to publish without totally confirming over and over again the dates. So they had assembled 21 or 22 or 23 dates, and they were getting ready to publish. This was what, 3 years ago in December? So we were down there, and yeah, so he said that they were about ready to publish, and it was 5,400 years at least old. So this thing here with these big old hills, 11 of them, is actually on the order of 1,200 years older than the pyramids of Egypt. 1,200 years older. And this shows some of the geometry that the mounds are actually laid out according to a geometry that involves the vesica piscis, which defines the layout. And it's interesting to find a vesica piscis determining the geometry of some of these ancient mound structures, because the vesica piscis is one of the key diagrams in all of sacred geometry that we find in architecture all over the old world, from olden days right down through the Gothic building period. And here it is showing up in the New World. And there's the pyramid complex with the Great Pyramid of Egypt here, and the Khephr's Pyramid here, the Sphinx out here facing to the east. And let's see, just to give you a sense of the scale, I've superimposed the Giza Plateau on the earthwork structure. And interestingly, here's an example of one of these many rings whose diameter is 760 feet, which is precisely the side length of the Great Pyramid. So we're finding all kinds of connections here. And again, here's another one of these 27 acres squares that recur over and over and over again. Almost as if to say, you know, there's some significance to this, 27 acre square. 1,080 feet on the side means that the perimeter of the square is 4 times 1,080, and that's 4,320. If you go into the ancient Vedas or the ancient Sumerian king lists, what you discover is that 4,320 was the base number of the whole system. And here we find it recorded redundantly into the ancient monumental architecture of North America. Engineers, this is a recent author who's been researching this stuff. Engineers have discerned in recent years what was known to the engineers of Hopewell times, that there are grids of straight lines upon which their earthen figures are laid. Lines invisible but real, leading to the horizon, to be discerned by repeated and patient observation of the heavens, and then traced upon the ground. When that is done, if one desires to be in harmony with the passages of the moon, one might do what the Hopewell did: place earthworks upon those invisible templates. Now, what I try to convey in my teachings in class is that this invisible template was not confined to one particular country or one particular region, but was in the ancient times global in extent. And it unified all the ancient cultures of the prehistoric world. But then that raises another mystery, and that is why so much of this was so effectively lost. And that brings us to a different subject altogether, which is the great year cycle and the cycle of catastrophes, and how the order of nature, the balance of nature changes according to a certain periodicity. And when it changes dramatically and abruptly. And that's going to be a subject of another talk. So anyways, we'll skip some of this here. Yeah, within the outer circle at Circleville is a ditch and then another inner circle. Its diameter is 1,056 feet. On Mound Builders Golf Course at Newark, across 40 miles of open country from Circleville and a mile from the fairgrounds, is a circle with a diameter of 1,054 feet. South of Circleville at High Banks on the Scioto near Chillicothe is one with a diameter of 1,052, and then another one with 1,050. Now what you got to remember is that these circles have eroded away. So as material slowly erodes away from the banks, they will diminish in diameter. And I think it's likely that 1,056 feet was the original measure for all of them.
You don't think that that's a pattern of some sort, a defining pattern, that they drop by 2 feet at each?
I considered that, but you know, as I looked at them, it did seem that in some of them there was very definite evidence of erosion having taken place. So I had to assume from that the original size was probably somewhat bigger. Another one, this is what Squire and Davis noticed. It has been observed that certain groups are marked by great uniformity of size. 5 or 6 of these are noticed in the succeeding pages. They are exact squares, each measuring 1,080 feet on a side. A coincidence which could not possibly be accidental and which must possess some significance. It certainly establishes the existence of some standard of measurement among the ancient people, if not the possession of some means of determining angles. Now back in the 1840s and 1850s, it was not possible for them to glean the significance of this relationship. In 2008, it is, I believe. Let's jump ahead a little bit here. Who were the mound builders? Now, this here, quote, kind of represents the prevailing wisdom, the prevailing dogma that you will read if you read any of the current literature on it, which goes back to the opinion held by Major J.W. Powell that the Indians found inhabiting the Atlantic division of North America and their ancestors were the builders of the mounds in that region, which the explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology under his charge have done much to confirm has been adopted. Now notice that's in 1890, 1891. So back in 1890 and 1891, the official view became that it was the predecessors of the immediate predecessors of the extant tribes that had constructed these earthworks. And that there were, and this is what I was mentioning at the inception of this talk, was that once that became the prevailing view, the racist attitudes of the Europeans and their descendants was that, well, if it was just the Indians that built these, they're of no significance. They were a bunch of, barbaric savages, and there could be no, there's nothing here worth saving. So if we need to, build an earth dam down here on the creek, well, we'll just go up and take some of this dirt from this mound. Or the farmers going up and plowing over the mounds and growing crops on them. And of course, once they cut into the soil and plow them, now they become subject to rapid erosion. Many of them, thousands of them, have been bulldozed in the process of urban development. So, writing in 1998, one of the researchers in current mounds, he writes, the federal government was instrumental in fostering the veer towards rationality in mound builder matters, specifically through the creation of the Smithsonian Institution of the Division of Mound Exploration, Bureau of Ethnology. Cyrus Thomas, a specialist in entomology as well as ethnology, was in 1881 appointed director of this activity, and in 1894 published a summary titled Report on the Mound Explorations, blah, blah, in addition to developing the framework of North American Indian culture areas and mound classification, largely still in use today. He reported results of the division's excavations proving that mound builder burial practices were seen among pre-Columbian Shawnee groups. Now, the essence of what I want you to get from this is that this model that was proposed in the 1890s is still the one in use today. There has been no subsequent research or findings that has essentially modified the model that was established by the federal government in the 1890s to explain, if not explain away, the phenomena of monumental earthwork architecture in North America. So, is safe to conclude then that the immediate predecessors of the current tribes inhabiting these regions were in fact the builders? Well, let's turn to some of what the Native Americans' own words and accounts had to say, as recorded by some of the first explorers and folks that lived with the Indians and talked to the Indians about these things.